We are entering an era where the most tectonic shifts in global power are happening in absolute silence, far away from the ballot boxes or the televised rallies we've been taught to watch. While the world stares at the chaos of changing administrations, a much deeper architecture is being installed, not by a king or a general, but by a silent administrator of a new global protocol. Prophecy doesn't always announce itself with the roar of engines. Sometimes it arrives as a strengthening of a system that's already in place. Today, we're peeling back the curtain on the technocratic framework emerging in the Middle East, a framework that Daniel's ancient warnings suggest is the ultimate snare, hidden in the very heart of what the world calls peace and safety. How do we define where a man truly belongs? When we look at the geopolitical stage today, we are taught to look at passports, at birth certificates, and at the lines drawn on a map by 20th century diplomats. We see Israel, we see Saudi Arabia, we see the United States. But what if the ancient prophecies aren't looking at those lines at all? What if they are looking at something far more permanent? To understand the architecture of the final days, we have to throw away our modern maps and look at the world through geographic energy coordinates. There is a persistent shadow in the books of Micah and Isaiah, a figure referred to as the Assyrian. For decades, prophecy students have debated, does this mean the end times leader must be a modern-day Iraqi or Syrian? Does he need to be a native of the Middle East to fulfill the text? But there is a detail that most modern analysts completely overlook, and this is the first reason why our current map is failing us. In the eyes of the prophets, identity is not defined by where a man is born, but by the specific pattern he reactivates. We have to move from a bloodline perspective to a systemic alignment perspective. Let's examine why this shift changes everything. Historically, the Assyrian Empire was more than just a kingdom. It was the world's first true multi-ethnic economic machine. It didn't just conquer through brute force, it integrated through craft. It created a vast unified zone where commerce and security were prioritized over local sovereignty. When the ancient texts warn of a figure rising from this pivot area, they are describing a negotiator who can resurrect that specific model of control. This is what we call the ghost of Assyria. It is a model of empire that has been dormant, waiting for a specific type of administrator to breathe life back into it. And this leads us to an unsettling question. What happens when a man from the West walks into this ancient cradle of civilization and manages to do what no native leader could? What happens when he confirms a framework that aligns these nations under a single protocol of peace and safety? In that moment, the geographic origin of the man becomes irrelevant. In the eyes of prophecy, he becomes the Assyrian because he is operating the Assyrian system. He is the hub in the center of the wheel. This is a perspective shift that most people aren't prepared to make. We are looking for a local dictator, but the text may be describing a global technocrat who reactivates an ancient geographic energy. Consider the pivot area, the land between the rivers, the crossroads of the world. Throughout history, whenever this region is unified under a single covenant, the world changes. And this is the second major hurdle in our understanding. We assume the end times covenant must be a brand new creation. But as we saw with the word Gabar, it is actually a strengthening of something that is already there. If someone can step into the most fractured region on earth and successfully sink the interests of historical enemies, they aren't just doing diplomacy. They are demonstrating a proof of concept for a new type of empire, one that doesn't need a king on a throne, but an administrator of the covenant. Why does this matter right now? Because we are watching the borders of the Middle East dissolve, not through war, but through alignment. When we see frameworks like the Abraham Accords or the emerging regional security blocs, we are seeing the unwalled villages of Ezekiel taking shape. These aren't just peace deals. They are the reactivation of an ancient geographic archetype. We have been conditioned to look for a conquest, but the prophets warned of a confirmation. And when you realize that a Western figure can embody an Eastern prophetic role by simply controlling the gears of the system, the map looks very different. The question isn't, where is he from? The real question is, what ancient mechanism is he turning on? And this brings us to a critical realization. If the empire of the end times is a borderless, technocratic revival of the Assyrian model, then the leader doesn't need an official title. He only needs the key to the protocol. But how does a man with no official standing obtain such a key? And how does he convince the world to trust a system that eventually leads to a snare? To understand that, we have to look past the man and into the administrative hub he is quietly building behind the scenes. Why do we always picture the rise of the ultimate deceiver as a military coup or a shouting dictator leading a massive army? We've been conditioned by history and Hollywood to look for the next Napoleon or the next Hitler, someone who seizes power through the barrel of a gun. But what if that's exactly the distraction we've been programmed to focus on? In a world as hyper-connected and fragile as ours, a military dictator is an inefficient relic of the past. To control the 21st century, you don't need a tank. You need a password. You need a protocol. Think about the state of global politics right now. We aren't just facing a lack of leadership. We are facing a total paralysis of the system itself. Whether it's the collapse of supply chains, the volatility of digital finance, or the endless cycles of regional security, the traditional nation-state is failing. Every president, every prime minister, and every career diplomat has tried to solve the Middle East puzzle using the same 20th century tools, and they have all failed. Why? Because the system they are working in is broken beyond repair. And this is where the concept of the neutral technocrat becomes so dangerously seductive. This is the assumption breakdown we have to address. We assume the man of lawlessness must be a man of war. But what if he is a man of systems? When we see a figure appearing at the center of global peace deals without an elected office or an official title, we are watching a new type of power take shape. This isn't diplomacy as we know it, slow, bureaucratic, and often performative. This is what we call neutral technocracy. It is the shift from a leader who demands you obey to an administrator who simply offers to make your life work again. A dictator demands you bow down, which naturally triggers resistance. But an administrator, he just offers to sync your banking, your security, and your identity into a single functional framework. He doesn't ask for your worship, he asks for your compatibility. This is the hidden variable that most prophecy teachers miss. When the Bible describes a figure who rises by craft and flattery, it isn't just talking about smooth words. It's talking about the ability to solve the world's most intractable problems through systemic integration. To understand this, look at how power operates in your own life today. You don't fear the CEO of your internet provider, and you don't worship the architect of the cloud where your banking data is stored. You just need your Wi-Fi to work and your money to be accessible. In our era, the person who holds the admin password to our shared infrastructure is inherently more powerful than any elected president. Presidents have terms. Administrators have access. But here is where the investigation reaches a chilling realization. We've been taught to wait for the Antichrist to create a brand new world religion. But what if he doesn't need to? What if he simply syncs the world into a single, hyper-efficient operating system? This is where the logic of the Hebrew word Gabar, to confirm or to strengthen, becomes terrifyingly clear. An administrator doesn't need to create peace from nothing. He simply takes the existing, failed negotiations, the tentative frameworks, and the stalled treaties, and he confirms them. He makes them firm. He makes them functional. He takes something that was weak and gives it the strength of a global protocol. When you look at the Abraham Accords or the framework negotiated in October 2025 through this lens, they look less like peace treaties and more like system updates. They are an alignment of interests, economic interests, security interests, strategic interests, and the man behind them isn't acting as a king. He is acting as the hub of the network. This neutral technocracy is the ultimate snare because it feels like relief. It stops the rockets in Gaza. It stabilizes the regional economy. It even paves the way for a temple in Jerusalem. It creates the unwalled villages of Ezekiel not through trust, but through a digital security protocol that makes traditional defense seem obsolete. It offers peace and safety by replacing moral agreement with functional dependence. Most people are looking for a man with a crown, but scriptural patterns suggest we should be looking for the man with the framework. The ultimate deception isn't a new war. It's the final solution to the world's broken systems. But as any user knows, once you give an administrator full access to your system to fix it, you have surrendered the only thing that matters, your sovereignty. We must ask ourselves, if the world is offered a choice between chaotic freedom and a perfectly managed peace, which one will it choose? The danger isn't that a dictator will take over the world by force. The danger is that we will voluntarily hand over the admin password to the man who promises to make everything work again. And by the time we realize he owns the system, it will be too late to log out. How does a fragmented world finally come together? For centuries, we believed that the only way to unify warring nations was through a visible throne or a heavy crown. But look at the technology that governs your daily life. How does a device in Tokyo communicate seamlessly with a server in New York? It isn't because one has conquered the other. It's because they both agree to follow the same protocol. And this is the comparative model we must use if we want to understand the true nature of the Middle East realignment happening before our eyes. We have been conditioned to see peace treaties as simple handshakes between leaders, a moment of diplomacy that ends a conflict. But what if we are looking at the wrong map? When we examine the frameworks being built today, from the Abraham Accords to the massive multi-nation agreements of late 2025, we are not watching diplomacy. We are watching the installation of a geopolitical operating system. Think about how your smartphone functions. When you accept a software update, you aren't just getting new emojis. You are allowing a central authority to rewrite the underlying code of your device. You do this voluntarily because the update promises better performance, more security, and smoother connection to the rest of the world. In the 21st century, this is exactly how global power is being exercised. A nation-state doesn't need to be occupied by an army to lose its sovereignty. It only needs to adopt a protocol that it cannot control. But here's the detail that changes the entire nature of these agreements. In the ancient world, an emperor needed to rule the territory. In the modern world, a technocrat only needs to rule the interface. Consider the scope of the framework negotiated in October 2025. It involved 8, 9, 10 major regional players, nations that have been historical rivals for generations. They weren't just signing a ceasefire, they were aligning their economic data, their security surveillance, and their strategic interests into a single integrated hub. This is why the modern world doesn't need a traditional emperor. It needs a systems architect. When a man with no elected office and no official title manages to bring these parties together, he isn't acting as a diplomat. He is acting as the admin of the new regional OS. And this leads us to the most unsettling part of the 2020 developments. The admin doesn't need to own the nations. He only needs to be the person who writes the terms of service. Once a country sinks its security and its economy into a shared framework, it has surrendered its admin rights. It has voluntarily handed over the keys to its internal systems to the person who maintains the network. Why would they do this? For the same reason you click accept on a 50-page digital contract without reading it, because you want the benefits. You want the peace and safety. You want the economic prosperity that comes with being part of the global grid. But as any developer knows, the person who sets the protocol has the power to confirm or delete any user on the network. This is the hidden law of the geopolitical protocol. It creates a threefold alignment that is impossible to break from within. Economic alignment, which makes war too expensive. Security alignment, which makes privacy impossible. And strategic alignment, which makes opposition feel like a system error. This is the Gabar process in action, the strengthening of a framework that already exists. Daniel's prophecy doesn't describe a man creating peace out of thin air. It describes a man who confirms a covenant with many. He takes the weak, fragmented systems of the past and strengthens them into a binding, high-tech protocol. The media focuses on the politics, but we must focus on the architecture. If the final countdown of history begins with a covenant, we should look for something that looks less like a treaty and more like a system update for the entire human race. A protocol that promises to fix every bug in the Middle East, the poverty, the rockets, the religious tension, but requires every nation to log into a single centralized account. And this is where the investigation takes an even deeper turn into the ancient Hebrew text. Because if this is a system update, then the confirm button has a very specific meaning. Most people think of it as a press conference or a signing ceremony. But in the original language of Daniel, the word used for confirm implies a level of mastery that goes beyond a signature. It implies the ability to take control of the very gears of the covenant and make them move in a single, irreversible direction. So we have to ask, if the framework is already being built and the nations are already syncing their systems, how much longer can the admin remain in the shadows? How close are we to the moment when the beta test ends and the global protocol becomes mandatory for everyone? To find that answer, we must look at the specific language used in Daniel 9:27, and the one word that most English translations have been hiding from us for centuries. When we read about the 7-year covenant in the book of Daniel, what is the specific image that comes to mind? For most, it is a grand, singular event, a world leader stepping onto a stage, pen in hand, creating a peace deal where there was once only chaos. We've been conditioned to look for a beginning, a sudden spark that ignites the prophetic clock. But what if we've been translating the action entirely wrong? What if the most significant event in human history isn't the creation of something new, but the formalization of something that has been hidden in plain sight for years? To understand the mechanics of the end times, we have to look past the English translations and dive into the original Hebrew of Daniel 9:27. This is the reframe mode we must adopt to see the reality behind the diplomacy. The text doesn't say he shall create or sign a covenant. It uses a very specific, potent word, Gabar. In its most literal sense, Gabar does not mean to start. It means to be strong, to prevail, or to make firm. It is a word of strengthening. In ancient contexts, it was used to describe a warrior surpassing others in strength, or a foundation being hardened to support a massive structure. When Daniel writes that the coming figure will confirm the covenant with many, he isn't describing a diplomat inventing a treaty from scratch. He is describing an architect who walks onto a construction site where the foundation has already been laid, the steel has already been raised, and the blueprints have already been approved. His role is to provide the master seal, the final confirmation that makes the structure operational. Consider the implications of this linguistic shift. If the covenant is strengthened rather than created, then the framework for the final 7 years must already exist before the man of sin ever officially confirms it. This changes our entire perspective on the timeline. We shouldn't be waiting for a miraculous peace deal to appear out of thin air. Instead, we should be looking for a pre-existing, tentative, and perhaps fragmented set of agreements that are waiting for a single, powerful hand to unify them into a binding legal reality. But how does this strengthening actually happen in a geopolitical sense? This is where the mystery bridge connects the ancient word to our modern reality. A confirmed covenant is essentially an upgrade of a beta system to a final version. It is the moment a series of informal normalization deals, like those we have watched unfold across the Middle East since 2020, are suddenly hardened into a formal, multi-nation legal framework with a strict 7-year expiration date. Think of it as the hardening of the infrastructure. For years, the world has been building the economic ties, the security protocols, and the diplomatic bridges between Israel and its neighbors. But these are currently weak covenants. They are subject to political whims, administration changes, and regional flare-ups. The act of Gabar is the moment someone steps in and makes these ties strong. He provides the international guarantees, the financial backing, and the personal craft required to make the deal unbreakable. This is why the events we are witnessing right now are so prophetically significant, yet so easily missed by the casual observer. We are watching the pre-Gabar phase. We are watching the assembly of the components. Every time a new nation joins a normalization framework, every time a new regional security protocol is synced between former enemies, the covenant with many is becoming more visible. It is being built piece by piece in the shadows of traditional diplomacy. But here is the detail that should make us pause. In the Hebrew Bible, Gabar is also linked to the idea of pride and insolence. It describes a strength that exalts itself. The confirmation of this covenant isn't just a legal act. It is an act of supreme ego. It is a man saying, "What the presidents and kings of the past could not finish, I have made perfect. What was weak, I have made strong." It is the ultimate proof of concept for a man who believes he has mastered the art of the deal to a supernatural degree. If we apply this logic to our current world, we realize that the 7-year countdown doesn't begin with a surprise. It begins with a seal of approval on a process that is already deep in its third or fourth act. We are not waiting for the movie to start. We are waiting for the climax of a story that has been playing for years. So we must ask, if the process is one of strengthening, what happens to those who refuse to be part of the strong system? And more importantly, what is the actual currency being used to buy this strength? Because in the world of geopolitical protocols, nothing is given for free. To make a covenant strong, something of equal value must be surrendered. To understand what is being traded for this peace, we have to look at the economic reality of the Middle East and the terrifying concept of peace as a form of collateral. Why would a nation, one that has been battle-hardened for 70 years, suddenly agree to lower its guard? To find the answer, we have to look past the political speeches and examine the behavioral economics of peace. We often view a ceasefire as a resolution of conflict, but in the logic of the modern world, peace is actually a form of collateral. Think about the nature of a high-stakes loan. When you take out a massive mortgage, you aren't just getting a house. You are pledging your future income and your primary asset as a guarantee. If you fail to pay, you lose the asset. This is exactly what is happening to the concept of national sovereignty in the Middle East right now. For decades, the conventional wisdom was that peace was a moral goal, but today, peace has been restructured into a financial transaction, specifically a collateralized peace. Here is the hidden variable that changes the entire prophetic picture. When nations sign on to hung normalization frameworks, these confirmations of the covenant, they are pledging their military self-determination as collateral for economic prosperity. By Kachkwanhua their security into a shared regional protocol, they are effectively saying, we will trade our right to act independently for the guarantee of foreign direct investment and inclusion in the global grid. But this creates a dangerous dynamic known in economics as cognitive anesthesia. As the GDP grows, as the skyscrapers rise in formerly hostile territories, and as the regional economy booms, a sense of relief washes over the population. This isn't just relief, no la mo, pharmacological effect on the national consciousness. When people become wealthy and comfortable, their instinct for vigilance begins to atrophy. They become willing to ignore the shifting terms of the agreement, the incremental loss of their borders, and even the erosion of their core values, provided the economic indicators remain green. We must ask ourselves, what is the true cost of an unwalled village? In the ancient world, walls were physical barriers. In our world, walls are the ability to say no to the global system. By removing Hung Rao Khan to trade and connection, Israel and its neighbors are entering a liquidity trap. They have become so dependent on the admin's network for their survival that the cost of conflict has become mathematically impossible to bear. They aren't at peace because they love their neighbors. They are at peace because they can no longer afford to be at war. And this is where the prophetic significance of the word confirm reaches its chilling peak. If the covenant is a debt, then the one who confirms it is the ultimate creditor. He is the one who holds the collateral. He provides the strength, the capital, and the stability that everyone has become addicted to. He isn't acting as a brother, he is acting as a guarantor. But as any economist will tell you, a system built on debt only remains stable as long as the creditor allows it to. What happens when the admin decides to call in the loan? What happens when the terms of the peace change and the collateral, the very sovereignty of the nations, is Koikung seized? This is not how traditional diplomacy works. This is how systemic capture works, and it explains why the Apostle Paul warned that destruction comes precisely when they say peace and safety. It's because the safety they are celebrating is actually a mortgage on their own destruction, a debt that will eventually be settled in a way that very few are prepared to handle. It is a peace that is managed, not lived. If we are watching a regional realignment, we aren't just watching a change in maps. We are watching the world's most intractable conflict being sold to the highest bidder. But to understand why the people will voluntarily walk into this transaction, we have to examine a deeper paradox, the trauma of survival that makes a fake savior look like the only hope. Let's look at the next part of this investigation, the paradox of salvation and why a weary world is finally ready to surrender. How do we explain a collective blindness that overcomes even the most cautious of people? We often assume that a deception of this global magnitude requires a lack of intelligence or a failure of education. We believe that if a false messiah were to appear, he would be easy to spot, a monstrous figure demanding worship through obvious evil. But this is the fundamental assumption breakdown we must address. We assume that deception targets the mind, but in reality, it targets the will. Specifically, it targets a state of being we call survival fatigue. If you have lived your entire life in a state of high alert, your definition of a miracle begins to change. For decades, the region of the Middle East has existed in a cycle of hypervigilance. When the human brain is subjected to a constant existential threat, the amygdala remains in a permanent state of arousal. Under this level of prolonged stress, a nation undergoes a profound cognitive shift. They stop looking for moral truth and start looking for an immediate solution. They stop asking, is this person from God? And start asking, does this person make the rocket stop? This is the hidden psychological mechanism that makes a silent trap possible. When the world is weary, it doesn't want a theology. It wants a functioning bank account, a stable border, and a night of sleep without sirens. This is the moment the problem solver steps out of the shadows. He doesn't arrive as a religious leader at first. He arrives as a highly efficient manager, a technocrat who promises to fix the broken gears of the system. And for a war-weary people, this efficiency feels like a form of salvation. We call this phenomenon reverse trauma. When a population has been traumatized by chaos for generations, the sudden onset of peace doesn't just feel good, it feels like a drug. It produces an addictive sense of relief that temporarily paralyzes the critical thinking faculties. But there is a specific reason why this relief is so dangerous. In the logic of biblical prophecy, the most vulnerable moment for a nation isn't when it is under attack, but when it believes the danger has finally passed. This is the Beitam Li Tap Thee, the collective psychological snare. When a community finally feels safe, they naturally begin to outsource their survival. They relax their guard. They dismantle their walls, on both physical and spiritual, because the cost of maintaining them seems unnecessary in a world that is finally working. Think about the specific language used in 1 Thessalonians 5:3. It says, "For when they shall say, peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them." Notice the word say. It doesn't require the peace to be real. It only requires the people to believe it is real. The trap isn't the war. The trap is the feeling of being saved from the war. In this state of cognitive anesthesia, a community will accept terms they would have rejected in a state of health. They will trade their long-term sovereignty for short-term convenience. They will accept a covenant, not because they trust the man who confirms it, but because they are too exhausted to keep fighting the system he offers to fix. They don't quibble over the fine print of a digital ID or a centralized banking protocol when those very things are presented as the keys to the end of a 70-year conflict. This is how the administrator gains his foothold. He doesn't need to be loved. He only needs to be essential. By solving the unsolvable problem, he becomes the singular hub of the regional network. And because the people are so desperate to maintain this new drug-like calm, they will defend the system even as it begins to tighten around them. They will celebrate the person who confirmed the peace, seeing him as a savior, unaware that the very strength he added to the covenant is the weight that will eventually crush their independence. We must understand that the man of sin doesn't rise by overcoming a strong world. He rises by offering to manage a broken one. He is the ultimate customer service representative for a humanity that has given up on governing itself. But as we see in the ancient texts, this reverse trauma has an expiration date. The question we have to ask is, when the relief wears off and the system requires its final payment, what will be left of the people who traded their vigilance for a moment of quiet? To find that answer, We have to look at what happens when the admin decides to perform a system-wide withdrawal. The moment of sudden destruction that follows the cry of peace and safety. What is the inherent cost of a system that works too well? We have explored how a neutral technocrat builds a world of seamless connection, but we must now confront the hidden fragility of that very success. In engineering, there is a principle known as single point of failure. It suggests that the more synchronized a network becomes, the more devastating a single error becomes. By centralizing the world's interests into a one-week covenant, a Gabar or strengthened protocol, the world isn't just buying peace. It is unwittingly building a global gallows. This is the hidden variable mode we must analyze, the power of the systemic withdrawal. We often focus on the administrator's ability to sync the world, but we rarely consider his absolute power to desync it. Think about a liquidity trap in the world of high finance. It occurs when a market becomes so integrated that everyone is moving in the same direction at the same time. While the money is flowing, the prosperity is breathtaking. But the moment the primary lender, the admin, decides to withdraw support, the exit is too small for the crowd. The system doesn't just slow down, it vanishes. This is the structural reality behind the sudden destruction mentioned in the ancient texts. It isn't necessarily a rain of fire from the sky. It is the instantaneous collapse of a civilization that has traded its resilience for efficiency. How does this withdrawal manifest in a geopolitical protocol? Consider the framework of the Middle East realignment. When 8 or 10 nations are synchronized into a single economic and security hub, they lose the ability to function independently. Their food supply depends on the admin's logistics. Their currency depends on the admin's ledger. Their security depends on the admin's surveillance grid. While the covenant is strong, the world celebrates. But this is a false security because it is entirely contingent on the will of a single point of failure. The Apostle Paul's warning in 1 Thessalonians becomes chillingly logical when viewed through the lens of systemic collapse. For when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them. Notice that the destruction isn't a result of a failed peace, but the direct consequence of a successful one. The snare is the synchronization itself. By the time the nations realize they have walked into a trap, they have already dismantled their internal walls. They have no offline mode. They have no way to survive a withdrawal of the system. But why would the administrator, the very man who spent years building this peace, deliberately trigger its collapse? This is the point where the investigation becomes unsettling. In the logic of the 7-year covenant, the admin doesn't want to manage the world forever. He wants to own it. Midway through the week, the book of Daniel describes a sudden halt. The admin causes the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. In a technocratic context, this is a system lockdown. It is the moment the terms of service are unilaterally changed. The administrator reveals that the peace was never the goal, it was the bait. By threatening to collapse the global ledger, by threatening to withdraw the security protocol that prevents regional war, he forces a final, absolute choice: total submission or total systemic annihilation. We must recognize that the sudden destruction is a feature of the system, not a bug. It is a systemic withdrawal designed to force the world into its final form. If you are synchronized into the protocol, you are part of the collapse. If you are dependent on the admin for your daily bread, his withdrawal is your starvation. This is the inherent danger of a world without walls. Walls were inconvenient, yes. They made trade slower and diplomacy harder. But walls also provided a buffer. They ensured that if one city fell, the next could still stand. In the confirmed covenant, there are no buffers. There is only the hub. This brings us to a terrifying question about our own era. As we watch the rapid sinking of global finance, digital identity, and regional security, are we watching the progress of peace, or are we watching the assembly of the global liquidity trap? If a single individual can now influence the frameworks of 10 nations without firing a shot, how close are we to the moment the withdrawal is triggered? To understand the full scope of this trap, we must look at the physical reality on the ground in Jerusalem, the city that serves as the primary server for this entire prophetic system. because the withdrawal cannot happen until the administrator moves his seat to the holy place. And as we will see, the towers of the New World aren't built of stone alone. They are built of data, and they are designed to leave no one a place to hide. What is the fundamental purpose of a wall? For thousands of years, the wall was the ultimate expression of a nation's sovereignty. It was the physical manifestation of the word no. A wall told the outside world, we are separate, we are independent, we control our own destiny. But as we look at the prophetic descriptions of the final days, we encounter a vision that seems to defy all military logic. In the book of Ezekiel, chapter 38, the prophet describes a land of unwalled villages, a people dwelling safely, all of them without walls and having neither bars nor gates. For generations, students of prophecy have interpreted this through the lens of naive trust. We imagined a Middle East so exhausted by war that Israel simply decided to dismantle its concrete barriers and turn off its Iron Dome. But is that a realistic scenario in our hyper-connected, high-stakes modern world? If we apply a boundary testing approach to this text, we must ask, at what point does a defense stop being a shield and start being a liability? What if the removal of walls isn't an act of faith, but a requirement of the system? In the 21st century, we have redefined the very concept of a wall. Today, a nation's most critical defenses are not made of stone or wire. They are made of encryption, firewalls, and autonomous defense protocols. Sovereignty is no longer about how high your physical fence is. It is about who holds the admin rights to your national security data. Therefore, when Ezekiel describes a nation without walls, he isn't necessarily describing a land of peace. He is describing a state of absolute systemic integration. Consider the seductive power of the Technocratic covenant. The admin of this global framework, the figure who confirms or strengthens the regional protocols, offers a deal that is almost impossible to refuse. He says to the nations, why bother with the immense cost of independent defense? Why maintain your own expensive, isolated walls when I can plug you into a global security grid? My satellites will monitor your borders. My algorithms will preempt your threats. My protocol will be your shield. This is the point where the paradox of salvation comes into play. When a nation has been battle-hardened and weary for 70 years, the offer of a shared security architecture feels like relief. It feels like progress. But in reality, it is the final step toward total dependence. By dismantling their independent defense firewalls to sync with the global protocol, these nations aren't just making peace, they are performing a systemic surrender. They are trading their physical bars for a digital subscription to a security they no longer control. Why does this matter right now? Because we are watching this very process unfold. When we see nations integrating their air defense systems, aligning their economic data, and syncing their regional surveillance, we are watching the walls come down in real time. They aren't dwelling without walls because the enemies have vanished. They are dwelling without walls because they have been told that the protocol is more reliable than their own strength. This is the era of absolute dependence. In the ancient world, if a wall was breached, you could still fight in the streets. But in our era, if you are integrated into a confirmed covenant, there is no offline mode for your survival. If the administrator decides to revoke your access, if he performs a systemic withdrawal, your defense doesn't just fail, it disappears. You are left in a land of unwalled villages with no bars, no gates, and no way to survive the sudden reset of the network. Pay close attention to the contrast Ezekiel highlights. He describes a people who are at rest and dwell safely. This is the drug-like calm of a population that has outsourced its vigilance. They have moved from the stress of being a self-defending unit to the comfort of being a user in a managed system. But as we see in the ancient texts, this comfort is the prerequisite for the final disaster. The Apostle Paul's warning that destruction follows the cry of peace and safety is a structural reality. The destruction is sudden, precisely because the people have removed every buffer between themselves and the central authority. We have been conditioned to look for a physical invasion, but the prophets may be describing a world that has been so successfully synced into a single point of failure that the invasion is merely the final settlement of a debt. The bars and gates are gone because they were an obstacle to the efficiency of the covenant. We have traded our sovereignty for a terms of service agreement that we never bothered to read. But this leads us to the most critical question of our era. If the nations are already sinking their defense and their economies into this borderless grid, what is the final key that unlocks total control? If the physical walls are down, what is the last barrier that the administrator needs to remove? To find that answer, we must move from the security of nations to the security of the individual. We must look at the battle for the admin rights of the human soul. Let's examine how does a global covenant signed by administrators and sovereign nations eventually reach the doorstep of your private life? We have explored the macro architecture of this new Middle East alignment, the unwalled villages, and the administrative protocols that sync entire countries into a single grid. But there is a final phase to this system update that most people fail to recognize until it is too late. We must move from the security of borders to the security of the individual. This is the perspective shift we have to make. The final conflict of history is not a battle for territory, it is a battle for access. For centuries, the world has debated the nature of the mark of the beast described in Revelation 13. We've looked for physical stamps, microchips, or obvious displays of evil. But in the logic of a technocratic covenant, the ultimate form of control is far more sophisticated. It isn't about a physical brand, it's about a system requirement. Think about the software that runs your computer or your phone. If you do not have the correct access token, the system simply does not acknowledge your existence. You aren't being attacked by the software, you are just being excluded from it. This is the hidden variable in the prophetic timeline. The mark is the final terms of service agreement for the human soul. It is the mandatory ID that allows you to interact with the new global operating system. Right now, we are watching the rapid integration of digital ID frameworks and central bank digital currencies across the globe. These aren't being presented as tools of tyranny, they are being marketed as tools of inclusion. They promise to bring the unbanked into the system, to streamline security, and to ensure that the peace and safety we've achieved is not disrupted by unverified actors. In the technocratic era, to be unverified is to be dangerous. But here is the detail that changes everything. In a world of unwalled villages, a world where everything is synced into the admin's hub, your survival becomes entirely dependent on your system status. In the ancient world, if you were an outcast, you could still trade grain in a hidden market. But in a system where the covenant has been strengthened through a digital ledger, there is no offline mode for the economy. When the Bible warns that no man might buy or sell without the mark, it is describing the ultimate account deletion. It is the unilateral power of the administrator to revoke your access to the grid. If you refuse to align with the mandatory protocol, you aren't just a dissenter, you are a system error. You are deleted from the economy, from the healthcare grid, and from the security architecture. You are left truly without walls in a world that has become a single fortified network. We must ask ourselves, why would the world accept such a condition? The answer lies in the collateralized piece we discussed earlier. By the time the mark becomes a requirement, the world will be so addicted to the convenience and the safety of the admin system that the cost of exclusion will seem worse than the cost of submission. People will trade their digital sovereignty for the ability to function within the peace. They will accept the protocol not because they love the beast, but because they cannot imagine surviving outside his network. This is the battle for access. The administrator doesn't need to hunt you down if he can simply invalidate your credentials. He doesn't need to fire a shot if he can make your money disappear with a single command. The mark is the final confirmation of the covenant. The moment the user agreement becomes mandatory for every human being on the face of the earth. But here is where the investigation reaches its most sobering point. If the infrastructure for this battle is already being built, if the Middle East is already syncing its surveillance, and the world is already adopting digital identities, then we are no longer talking about a distant future. We are talking about the beta test of the final system. The question is no longer, when will this happen? The question is, are you already being conditioned to accept the protocol? To survive a world of absolute dependence, we have to understand what it means to remain decentralized in our spirit. We have to recognize the snare while it still looks like convenience. But to do that, we must understand why the figure at the center of this realignment might not be the final actor, but a prototype. We need to examine why what we see today is a proof of concept for a power that the world is not yet ready to face. Is the figure we see standing at the center of these global realignments truly the final actor in this prophetic drama? It's a question that has sparked intense debate across the world, but to find a grounded answer, we have to step away from the headlines and look at this through the lens of a comparative model. In the world of high-level software engineering, before a major system is released to the public, developers run what is called a beta test. It is a controlled environment designed to identify bugs, test the gears of the system, and, most importantly, prove that the underlying architecture actually works. What if what we are watching in the Middle East right now is not the final fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy, but a profound proof of concept? We have been conditioned to look for a monster rising from the sea, but as we've explored, the technocratic era suggests a much more subtle emergence. However, there is a persistent trap in prophecy teaching that we must address. For 2,000 years, sincere believers have pointed at every powerful man, from Nero and Napoleon to modern presidents, and declared them to be the Antichrist. Every one of those identifications was wrong. But here is the detail that most people miss. Just because they weren't the final figure doesn't mean they weren't part of the beta cycle. Think about the architecture of power. The ultimate deceiver doesn't want to waste time building a global surveillance grid, a centralized banking protocol, or a regional security alignment from scratch. He wants to move into a house that is already fully furnished and operational. He needs a world that has already been conditioned to accept admin rights as a standard part of life. Therefore, the role of a beta figure is not to rule the world, but to demonstrate that the world can be ruled through these specific methods. Consider the current realignment. When a man with no official title manages to sink the interests of historical enemies, he is providing a proof of concept for the word Gabar. He is proving that you don't need a military invasion to remove walls. You only need a shared protocol. He is demonstrating that a covenant with many is not a theological impossibility, but a functional necessity for modern survival. If a Western administrator can successfully manage the Middle East today, it proves that the system is ready for the final administrator tomorrow. But why is this rehearsal so critical for the admin who is yet to come? And this is where the investigation becomes truly unsettling. A beta test is designed to lower the barriers to entry. It makes the snare look like an upgrade. By the time the final figure steps onto the stage to confirm the ultimate covenant, the world will have already seen a dry run of the peace. They will have already become addicted to the collateralized safety we discussed. The unwalled villages will already be the norm. This is the perspective shift we must make. We are not waiting for a surprise. We are watching the world complete its user onboarding. We must ask ourselves, if the current figure is only the prototype, then how much more efficient and how much more seductive will the final version be? If the world is already this willing to surrender its sovereignty for a managed peace, what will happen when a figure appears who can not only manage the economy, but can seemingly perform signs and wonders through the very system he controls? This is why scriptural discernment is so vital. Jesus didn't tell us to become detectives hunting for a specific name. He told us to watch the pattern. He told us to recognize the season. When you see the infrastructure being laid, when you see the gears being synced, and when you see the beta test proving successful, you know the final release is imminent. But if we are indeed in the beta phase of the final system, then our response shouldn't be panic, but a radical decentralization of our own thinking. We have to learn how to exist outside the protocol before the admin makes the system mandatory. To understand how to maintain that vigilance in a world of absolute connection, we have to look at the final takeaway of this investigation. We have to understand the real warning Jesus gave us, a warning that has nothing to do with identifying a man and everything to do with protecting your soul from the sink. What is the ultimate goal of all this investigation? We have spent this time peeling back the layers of a new geopolitical architecture, deciphering ancient Hebrew roots like Gabar, and analyzing the mechanics of a technocratic system update. But as we reach the conclusion of this journey, we must confront a final, unsettling perspective shift. We often believe that the most important task of a watchman is to identify the name of the deceiver. We spend countless hours as prophetic detectives, hunting for a face, a birth certificate, or a specific political career that matches the profile. But we must ask ourselves, if we successfully identify the administrator of the global protocol, does that actually save us from the system he manages? Jesus gave extensive teachings about the end times in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. He spoke of false prophets, the abomination of desolation, and the signs of the times. But here is the detail that almost everyone overlooks. In all his warnings, not once did Jesus command his followers to find the Antichrist. Instead, his instruction was singular and repetitive. Watch. To understand what it truly means to watch in the technocratic era, we have to redefine our concept of alertness. In a world that is being synced into a centralized hub, where your economy, your security, and your identity are being integrated into a single covenant, the greatest danger is not the man who signs the deal. The greatest danger is the synchronization itself. If you know the name of the admin, but your entire life is still running on his operating system, then you are still part of the snare. This brings us to the core of our final realization. The only effective resistance to a centralized protocol is a decentralized spirit. Think about the architecture we've discussed, the unwalled villages, and the collateralized peace. These systems thrive on functional dependency. They win when you believe that you cannot survive without logging in to the global grid. Therefore, true spiritual alertness is not just about having the right information, it is about reducing your systemic dependency. It is about moving from a state of absolute dependence on the world's protocols to a state of radical sovereignty in your own spirit. Consider the beta test we are witnessing right now, or if the current realignment is a proof of concept for the final release, then it is also a grace period for us to upgrade our own internal defenses. While the world celebrates a managed peace, we are being called to develop a decentralized mindset. This means refusing to be synced into the collective fear and greed that drives the system. It means recognizing that when the world cries peace and safety, they are actually describing a mortgage on the soul. We must ask ourselves, are we using this time to become more compatible with the coming protocol, or are we learning how to exist offline? Throughout history, every wrong identification of the Antichrist has damaged the credibility of the watchman. It makes the world dismiss genuine warnings as sensationalism. But when we shift our focus from hunting the bad guy to protecting the human soul, the investigation takes on a different weight. We stop looking for a monster and start looking for the snare of convenience. We stop fearing a dictator and start resisting the seductive ease of a world that promises to fix every bug at the cost of our freedom. The real test of the 7-year covenant is not whether you can guess who signed it. The real test is whether you are still standing when the systemic withdrawal occurs. Will you still be alert? Will you still be grounded in a truth that exists outside the administrator's ledger? The administrator wants to turn humanity into a series of predictable nodes in his network. He wants to optimize our behavior through his protocol, but a soul that is awake cannot be optimized. A spirit that is decentralized cannot be deleted. As we watch the frameworks form and the gears of the beta test begin to turn, remember that the most powerful thing you can do is not to find a name, but to reclaim your sovereignty. Do not be deceived by the drug-like calm of the new realignment. The walls are coming down, but you do not have to be a citizen of an unwalled village. You can choose to dwell in a truth that requires no terms of service and no admin password. The final countdown has not begun with a war, but with a strengthening of the grid. But even as the system reaches its final release, there is still time to log out. There is still time to watch. There is still time to be ready for the return of the only king whose kingdom is not a protocol, but a promise. Is the ultimate price of a world without friction? We have spent this journey examining the blueprints of a new global architecture, a system where ancient prophecies intersect with the cold efficiency of 21st century technocracy. We've seen how geographic archetypes like the Assyrian model are being reactivated, how power is shifting from elected leaders to silent administrators, and how peace is being restructured as a collateralized debt. But as we reach the end of this investigation, we must confront the most personal question of all. What happens to the human soul in a world that is perfectly managed? We often speak of the flat world as a triumph of progress. It is a world where distance is irrelevant, where economies are synced, and where the unwalled villages of Ezekiel are no longer a dream, but a technical requirement. But there is a hidden law of boundaries that we ignore at our peril. In the physical world, a wall creates friction. It makes trade harder and movement slower. But that same wall also provides the space for sovereignty. It provides the buffer required for a nation or an individual to say no to the collective. When the administrator confirms the covenant, when he strengthens the protocol that connects all of us into a single grid, he is effectively removing the friction from human existence. He is offering a life that is seamless, safe, and hyper-efficient. But this is the boundary testing we must perform. At what point does a world without friction become a world without freedom? Consider the drug-like calm of the new Middle East realignment. We see historical enemies now syncing their surveillance data and their bank ledgers. We see a region that was once a chaotic storm of ideology now being optimized by a technocratic hub. To the war-weary, this feels like salvation. It feels like the end of history. But if you look closely at the terms of service of this new peace, you will see the trap. The snare is not the threat of violence, it is the promise of convenience. We have been conditioned to fear the mark of the beast as a dark, occult ritual. But in the era of the technocratic protocol, it may arrive as nothing more than a mandatory system update. It will be presented as the only way to protect the peace we have built. It will be marketed as the ultimate tool of inclusion, the only ticket to the safety the world has been crying for. And in that moment, the choice will not feel like a battle between good and evil. It will feel like a choice between remaining compatible or being deleted. This brings us to the final, lingering question that you must carry with you into your daily life. Every time you see a new digital ID framework being announced, every time you hear of a new Gabar or strengthening of a regional alliance, you must ask yourself, am I watching the dawn of a new era, or am I watching the final onboarding of a global prison? We have entered a time where the beta test is nearing completion. The infrastructure of the 7-year covenant is almost fully laid. The admin is already in the shadows, holding the keys to the protocol. The headlines you read are no longer just news, they are system notifications. So here's the choice that history is forcing upon us. Would you prefer a world that is chaotic, dangerous, and broken, but where your soul remains decentralized and free? Or do you prefer a world that is peaceful, prosperous, and perfectly managed, but where your very existence is a subscription managed by an algorithm you cannot see? The Apostle Paul warned that destruction comes when they say peace and safety. He didn't say it comes when they are afraid. He said it comes when they are satisfied. The danger is not that the system will fail. The danger is that it will succeed too well. As the walls continue to come down and the world continues to sink, do not let your critical spirit be optimized out of existence. The truth is not found in the stability of the grid or the promises of the administrator. The truth is found in the one kingdom that refuses to be part of the protocol, a kingdom that doesn't offer a digital update, but a spiritual awakening. The system is ready. The covenant is waiting for its final confirmation. The only question left is, when the admin finally requests your password, will you have the strength to remain offline? Watch the headlines, discern the patterns, and above all, reclaim your sovereignty before the system makes it a memory. Because the final release is coming, and in a flat world, there is nowhere left to hide.